Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wish everybody a beautiful day. Joining with us here is Howard Ross, and thank you so much for joining our show and sharing about your story. It's gonna give us a lot of inspirations and the motivations to carry on day by day. So thanks again for your time,
Thank you.
Howard. Yeah. So to start the program today, would you please share with us a bit about yourself, your work, and how all the great work started? Yeah.
Sure, of course. Thank you so much. And my warmest greetings to everybody over there. As I was just saying to you as we were prepping, I love Asia and I plan to come to Vietnam. And because of COVID, we haven't been able to get there. So I look forward to that. But I'm so glad we had this opportunity to chat. Um, it's funny. I think like a lot of us, we are the product of the world we grow up in, and for me, that was very much the case. My family is Jewish. Our family originated in Eastern Europe, and so while my grandparents all came to the United States in the early part of the 20th century, their families were still left behind and suffered tremendous loss during the Holocaust during World War II. And that deeply affected my family, and I think particularly my generation of my family, my two sisters and I, in that we grew up with these very strong messages. I'm 71 years old, so I was born just 5 years after the end of World War II. And so we grew up with two very strong messages in our family. One was that terrible things can happen, and the other was that you're supposed to do something about it. That we had some great role modeling from my grandparents. My grandfather on my mother's side and my grandmother on my father's side were both very active. My grandfather was particularly active in not only helping Jewish children escape Nazism during the war, but also in the development of the NAACP, the racial justice organization in the United States. He really believed strongly in racial justice. My grandmother was an organizer for women's workers, labor union for women. And so those are two very strong messages. And so when I became a teenager, I got involved early in the civil rights movement. Later, I got involved with the Farm Workers Union, doing organizing work for the Farm Workers Union. I participated in anti-Vietnam War protesters, or I guess you would say anti-American war protesters. Um, and so that was my path. And I was also a teacher in New York City. Coming out of college, I was a teacher for very young children. And the two things came together after I was promoted to running a school and had, all of these people, and I had no idea how to make it all work. So, because I didn't have any skill in management, so I went back and studied organizational development and that stuff, and I learned about culture development in organizations. And then the two things came together when the diversity movement started in the 1980s, and I started to get involved in helping organizations explore diversity, and that it sort of took off from there. So that's now 37 years ago, I think, long, long time ago.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story from the beginning, and it's very emotional for us because the past that you've been through, we've been watching the episode after episodes regarding to the World War I, World War II, and we see how the unjust the world was, and then and you in here you I noted down that your parents told you that terrible things could happen, and but we need to do something about that, right? And so back then, when you were a little boy, 5, 10 years old, and then when we were kid, we always have a dream of one day we're gonna become somebody doing something, right? Back then, Howard, what did you dream one day you're gonna become?
Well, it's such a good question. I don't think anybody's asked me that question in a long, long time. So thank you. I mean, I had some of the same kinds of dreams. I think that a lot of kids had, playing center field for the New York Yankees baseball team or things like that. But the truth was that wasn't really it. I think from a very young age, my mother really wanted me to be a doctor. My mother thought that being a doctor was the highest level that you could have as a human being, and I think partly it was because she was an exceptionally intelligent woman who didn't get to go to college because her brothers had to go. And at the time, because she grew up in the 1920s, 1930s, that was really standard. The boys went to college, the girls maybe went, but not usually. The girls were looking to get married, right? And she should have been a doctor. So I think she projected that on me, and that stuck with me really all through high school. It wasn't until I got to college, and it was a combination of things in college. Firstly, I started to take all the courses and just didn't enjoy them all that much. I mean, I could have done them okay, it's just I didn't enjoy them all that much. But mostly, I was distracted by and paying much more attention on the my organizing stuff, the political stuff that was happening, particularly because this was 1968 when I went to college, so it was right in the middle of the Civil War movement, as I said, the Vietnam War, the farm workers union, so much was going on there. And so it just became clear to me that that was my mom's dream and not mine. And so, I had to respectfully step down from that role and pursue my own path. And from there, it's often, I often have described it a feeling of like a 2-year-old running downhill trying to stay on their feet. I was following my curiosity. I didn't, of course, there was no diversity industry at that time. There was no profession called diversity work at that time. So I could not have aspired to something. It didn't even exist at the time. But it was more like, wow, this is interesting, and that's interesting, and this is interesting, and this is interesting. And I would just sort of follow my interest and my passion, and a deep commitment that I had to want whatever I was doing to make a difference, which I think is what I got from my grandparents.
Howard, back then, how did you talk to your mom to turn her idea that one day you become a doctor, to become, the activist and make the change to the world in a different way? How did she respond to that?
Reactions, yeah.
Well, it's not an easy client. I mean, not an easy conversation. Excuse me, because Jewish mothers are not unlike Asian mothers, in that they have designs on their children's future, and it's important for the family in very much the same way. But I think that my parents were concerned at first that what I was doing wasn't significant enough, wasn't going to take care of my family. They grew up in the Great Depression. And so they were very focused on being sure that you can take care of your family and your responsibilities, of course. And it took a while, but at some point, I think that they began to realize how passionate I was about it and that I was doing good work. And they started to hear things from people. So I remember one time they came for a visit to the school that I was running, and 2 or 3 of the parents pulled them aside and just told them what a great job I was doing for their children and for their families. And so they started to feel pride about what I was doing that replaced the disappointment of what I wasn't doing.
I think that Asian mother also has this, a same mentality. I think high expectation for their children. My mom is an example. So she came into the family of lack, and then she tried to saving so that she can send me and my sister overseas for education. And that's how the privilege I got to meet Vivian. And at the beginning, I was the one who really reject the idea, because being at home, being in a comfort area, and then it's so cool, and then now going out to the world is too cruel out there. So the rejection were coming from my ends, but now I really appreciate that. That strength, that courage, and that wisdom that she had back then, to push the boundary and send us to where we can get the network, the educations, the level of thinking. So our moms are beautiful, and they are what?
Well, I think that the other thing for me was that my parents, both of them, at their core, really believe in equality. They believe in fairness. They believe in equity. They believe in diversity. My mom, for example, had these 2 young men who she didn't drive, and after my father passed away, she needed to have somebody drive. So she had these 2 young men who were a gay couple who would drive her everywhere. She would make good friends with them. They would help her around the house, and she was very early, very, very early in standing out for fairness towards people who were gay, for example. My dad used to tell stories about when he was in World War II as a soldier, that he one night, went to a hotel with a friend of his who was a black soldier, and the hotel wouldn't let the soldier stay. So instead of my father staying in the hotel, they slept in the car together, because he was not going to stay somewhere where his friend couldn't stay. So there were stories in my family about these values, and I think that at a core level, even if my parents were a little concerned about me making ends meet financially, they completely supported the values, and so that made it a lot easier as well.
Wow.
It wasn't like I was doing something they disapproved of. They were just worried that I wouldn't be able to make it in the world.
Wow.
So.
I think that the biggest lesson that they teach you is to become a good person, and then a good person with with the great values is some, then when you have that from the inside, there's nothing that can change you or can impact you, can influence you from the outside, right? Hmm.
That's right.
And how's the journey to become an expert in diversity and inclusion all started? Can you share that journey with us? Because the works that you do 30 years, 40 years ago, that was non-existing.
Yep.
Yeah,
That's right.
it's only
Right.
existing in the corporate in the political level, where the country talk to countries, government talk to
Open
the
up.
people,
Yeah.
but not at the consulting firm coming to organizations and talk to people about that. And even now, 40 years later, we still struggling, we still working our ways up to build culture that promote diversity inclusions. But then you started that 30 something years ago. Tell us that story, please.
Sure, of course, of course. Well, I think that when I look back to that time, I really had two parallel lives in terms of my interests. There was the work that I was doing around civil rights and diversity, and that was in the community. I would participate in various different activities and go to protests and all that kind of stuff, and working for civil rights.
Mm.
But then there was the work that I was doing in the organization, where I was learning about organizational development and how to make an organization really work for people who were working in it, and building the right kind of culture in organizations. And so, for the most part, at that point, there were two parallel paths.
Mm.
The civil rights stuff was out of my job in the community. The other stuff was in my job. I think what really changed it was in 1985, I believe it was. I got contacted by some old friends who I had worked with in the civil rights movement, and they said, we're doing this new work in organizations called diversity work.
Mm.
And basically, it was like, they're now paying us to do the stuff they used to throw tear gas at us for. So it was intriguing to me, and we started doing it, and I found that, first of all, it was great we were having these conversations, but a lot of them were very didactic, like very much making people, you're wrong for being this, you're being a racist, you're being a sexist, and I began to notice relatively early in that it just didn't work. That what we were doing was, it worked for some people. If people were sort of already leaning in that direction, then it certainly could work for them. But for people who came in with some resistance or not understanding, they felt shamed and made wrong, and that, of course, caused them to contract, not to expand. It was, I think young people today would say, we were calling people out rather than calling them in.
Mm.
We were, and so I began to get troubled by that, and then, as I started to do more of the work by myself, I started to find new ways of doing it, and a big piece of the change for me happened in the 1990s, when I began to broaden my own spiritual path. As I said, I grew up in a Jewish family, and culturally I feel very strongly about being Jewish, but I began to explore Buddhism and Hinduism and Sufism, some of the more mystical traditions, and particularly Buddhism, which was the first one really that I dove into. I began to see that there's very different ways of looking at personality and the development of human personality in Buddhism than there is in Western thought. This notion that in Western thought we feel like our personalities are fixed, and of course, the very core of Buddhism, the lotus, the diamond in the heart of the lotus, is about that there's a deeper self in us that's not controlled by that personality, where we can find meditation in the light. And so, as I studied that more, I began to find, well, if I look at some of these people out there who have some of these beliefs that I don't agree with, or that I think are wrong, rather than treat them like bad people, maybe I can get them back to that jewel in the heart of their lotus. Maybe I can get them back to their humanity and get them to see that the rest of this stuff is learned behavior. It's stuff that they've been taught about Black people, about Asian people, about Hispanic people. That it's not true. It's just something that you were told and you've taken in. And I can treat people actually more respectfully. I can honor their humanity even while disagreeing with their point of view. And what I began to notice was that people responded to that in a very different way. Some of the people who would come in and be like this, like, keep this work away from me, were now saying, wow, this is interesting. And because I'm a little ADD, my mind flits around a bit, I then started to say, well, gee, there's this new research coming out from neuroscience and cognitive sciences about the brain and how much unconscious bias dominates our decision making, and so that became part of the equation. And then I started to, take this out to my clients, and I'd work with them, and I'd find that, all of a sudden, places where you had to felt like you were sliding, people were like excited about this work. They were really interested about this work because it not only taught them how to treat other people better, it taught them how to make better decisions in general better. It actually served them in a broader way. And then the rest of it is really, timing and luck. Really, I had a friend of mine, a client, I should say, who I'd done some of this work with. She ended up being on the planning committee for a major conference here in the United States. She convinced them to have me do a keynote at that conference about this work. Mind you, at this time, there was nobody talking about unconscious bias in the mainstream diversity space, almost nobody. And so it was this kind of new thought. It was mostly in the academy, in colleges and universities that people were studying this stuff. So I gave this talk, and people said, wow, this is amazing. Can you write a paper about it? So I wrote a paper, and they published it, and it went viral, and millions of hits on the paper. And then a publisher contacted me about writing my first book, Reinventing Diversity, which led to my second book, Everyday Bias, which came out in 2014. And that book happened to come out 1 month after a very dramatic race relations incident in the United States when a young man named Michael Brown was killed by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. You probably remember that.
Yes.
Because it certainly got international appeal. And within a month, everybody was talking about unconscious bias, and my book came out. And so, timing being everything, it became a bestseller. And then the company grew and grew and grew. And then the last piece of it was that as I was getting into this research, studying the unconscious mind and the like, I began to notice an important stream, and that was that this feeling, this desire human beings have for belonging, for fitting in, for being part of something. And of course, this is much more obvious, I find, in Asian culture than it is in American culture, because American culture is so much about independence, about everybody being their own person. Asian culture really honors the role that people play in the community and the role that they play in the family in a much more profound way, and I think a much more natural way. And so I started to talk about that, and that led to my last book, Our Search for Belonging, which was really framed in the context of looking at the tribalism that we see in our culture right now and how that gets created by this need to fit in. But when we're fitting in against something rather than for something, you end up getting this kind of tribalism. So that led to that. And then back in 2018, as you said, I did sell my company, Cook Ross, after 30 years. And the reason was because I was just getting to a stage in my life, as I was 67 at the time, and I was getting to a stage in my life where whatever work I continued to do, I wanted to focus mostly on doing the work itself rather than running a company. Running a company of 50 consultants is a lot, and I just wanted to spend whatever time I felt I still had doing this work, being able to do the work. So we did start a new company. My wife, I say we, my wife and I, she's been my business partner for 30 years, and as well as my life partner, I guess very much like the two of you. And so we decided to create this little company, Udarto, which is actually the Hindi word for compassion and generosity. And since then, I've mostly been taking on project by project. I've been doing a lot of work on racial reconciliation and looking at how to break up systemic racism and some other work on I would say half of my work is for free, for charity, pro bono work. I don't charge for. So most of what I do now is in service to the community, and I've just been, and of course since the last major racial incident we had when George Floyd was killed back in the summer of 2020, that expanded dramatically people's willingness at some level to talk about race relations in businesses and the like. So we have had an opportunity to do that. Now, one of the other sides of that is that, as you probably know, there's been a backlash reaction to some of that here in the United States, and a lot of this push against what people are calling critical race theory, although it's not really critical race theory. They just don't want people talking about race. And I was targeted by some of the right-wing extremists on that field for a while, so I got a lot of hate mail and the like. But when you can't live a life shaking the trees and expect never to get hit on the head by a coconut. So it's been well worth it.
I missed the part that you mentioned your name's wife. What's her name?
My wife's name?
Yes.
Is Leslie Trout.
Leslie.
Leslie Trout.
Okay. Tell her that we say hi, please. Tell her that we say thank you for for us
Taking
to
you
have the for
away.
us to have the privilege of taking you away for 1 hour from her, and so.
It's very, very fun.
But
Yeah, very fun.
Howard, I want to bring you back to from the first time when you wrote the book, Reinventing Diversity. Okay, you've been in diversity for a very long time, and then you we can proudly say that you coined the works for diversity, and then by 2011 you introduced the word, something that called reinventing diversity, and up until now the definition of diversity has changed dramatically from one workshop to the next workshop, from one group of consultant to the next group of consultant. And I think the terms is the definition of it is also keep on evolving. It's like a living body. So, if you are expert at diversity and inclusion, can you tell us what is the diversity definition in your definition, and reinventing it means what for our audience?
Sure. Sure. Well, we look at some of these terms because they do get these terms are used differently by different people. I think that,
Mm.
generally speaking, when I'm talking about diversity, what I mean is that, you know, expanding representation, getting more and more different kinds of people
Mm.
engaged. Now, just getting them in the organization we know isn't good enough, because if we hire them in the organization, but all people of color, for example, like we saw this a lot, fortunately it is starting to change, but we certainly still see it in some places. The lowest levels are very diverse in terms of race, a lot of racial diversity, a lot of people from different racial groups. But then when you get to the upper levels, it's mostly white men, right?
Mm.
And so we knew at some point very early that just getting people into the organization wasn't enough. We had to get people included into the culture. We had to give people the opportunity to be successful, and that's where the whole conversation about inclusion came from, which is that people are here, but we need to make sure that they're engaged, they're involved, that their voices are heard more.
Mm.
But then even there was another level which we at some point we realized, once we had gotten past diversity and inclusion, we said, okay, that's fine, but people are still being included in organizations that are mostly still run by people like this.
Mm.
So you could be successful in my organization, but there's a whole nother level, which is, can you be actually at the table making decisions around the organization? So that's where the whole belonging conversation came in. That
Mm.
full belonging is really having a full seat at the table. So having said all that, I sometimes say that in shorthand, and what I say is that you might think of it this way: diversity is being invited to the party,
Mm.
inclusion is being allowed to dance,
Mm.
and belonging is getting to choose the music.
Oh, choose the music.
Choose the music.
Very
Ah,
nicely
very
put,
nice.
yeah.
Yeah. So it does continue to expand, and I think sometimes people get impatient with the changing language, but I think that we have to remember that this is still a relatively new topic. It's
Mm.
only been around for 40 years,
Mm.
and so we are always discovering new things and new depth and new distinctions that
Mm.
require us to use new language. Just like you or I might look at a scalpel, that a doctor holds and say that's a knife, but the doctor says, no, it's not a knife, it's a scalpel. There's a difference. There's a difference between a scalpel and a knife to a doctor that you or I might not see, as we're not doctors, right?
Mm.
So I think these distinctions are really helpful. Now, having said all that, where the reinventing diversity conversation came from was really an evolution of what I was talking about earlier, when I saw that the way we were doing this work was very much about sort of political angle, that we were pretty rudimentary, pretty simple in terms of how we were doing the work, and we weren't capturing the complexity of it. And I began to realize, especially, that there were three pieces to this that needed to fundamentally change. One was to recognize and to begin to learn about culture, and to recognize how much culture determines people's background way of looking at the world. And people at that time in the diversity space, when I wrote it was probably 2010, came out in 2011, there wasn't a lot of talk. There had been fairly early talk about culture, and I had gotten into studying culture when I was working with hospitals, when they were my clients, and realizing, for example, actually, this story could probably be really interesting to you. So I was working with a hospital in Flint, Michigan, and one of the people who was in the hospital, who was trained to be a facilitator, came to me. Her name was Bonnie Jacobs, and she said, something curious happened. I just, out of curiosity, ran some computer data on patient outcomes, how patients did relative to different diseases. And what I found was that when Vietnamese women come into our hospital to deliver babies, they get dehydrated more than other people. And I have no idea. She said, I talked to people who were doctors and obstetrics and gynecologists. They had no idea. Well, my son was studying to be a doctor at the time, and so I went to the medical school library with him, and I started to look through some books around cultural medicine, and lo and behold, what I discovered is hot and cold theory, which is, of course, that yin-yang balancing system that you all, I'm sure, very familiar with in the medicine system that you use, but we had no idea about. And it turns out that delivering a baby or times when there's a lot of bleeding are considered cold times, and you treat that. One thing you do is you give people warm drinks rather than cold drinks. But what was normal for us here in this country was to give women in labor ice chips and ice water to drink. So the women wouldn't drink the water. And so they would get dehydrated. It would cost the hospital more money because they would stay longer. It would obviously impact the mother's health. It would impact connection between the mother and the baby because it would delay lactation for the mother. And all of this could be simply resolved by a nurse knowing to say, what temperature water would you like? Would you like warm or cold water, right? And so that opened up a whole world of information about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories like that came from different cultures around the world, and how different health practices were aligned with those different cultures. And so I started to study cultural competency, and that became one piece of this equation. Like, we need to understand culture more. Then the second piece really had to do with the unconscious bias piece, and that was that I started to realize that while we had basically done our work with this sort of notion that if we taught people to be good people, that they would do the right thing, the truth was that the unconscious bias research taught me that most of us have no idea what's motivating us. And unless we turn inward, I like to say we turn the flashlight towards ourselves, we begin to study ourselves and really understand where our motivations are coming from, we'll never see that. So that made the study of unconscious bias so important, and that was the second piece of the thought. And then the third piece was that mostly what I began to notice was that organizations were doing diversity work very differently than they were doing other culture change initiatives. Like, for example, I had one organization that was doing a big safety initiative. They wanted to make sure that workers were being safe. It was a utility company where bad things can happen if people make mistakes. People get electrocuted, for example. And I saw the way that they did this. They had a plan and a strategy, and they did some education, and they looked at systems and structures. In other words, they took a systems approach. But almost nobody was doing that relative to diversity. Mostly was, we'll do a training here, we'll have a special event here, we'll have International Food Day in the cafeteria, we'll do this, and then we check it off and call it a diversity program. But I knew that wasn't how cultures change. I knew that from the study that I'd done in organizational development. So the third was that we had to take a systems approach. We had to start thinking from the standpoint of the entire system and what were the levers to that system. So those became the three foundations of that book of Reinventing Diversity.
So first is learning the cultures, and then the culture competencies, right? And then the unconscious bias, and then an approach in systematic way, so that it can reinvent the diversity. So your 40 years of learning, we can only understand in that three things in the very basic. But thank you for sharing that. It's our job to take that action, to keep on learning and dive in more to get know more about the. How to build a diversified culture, and I think that with yes, do you want to say something?
I think it's the first time. It's very interesting for me to get a very simple definitions, because I first thought diversity is something very big. Everybody talking in the company, about diversity, but it's only the first step. Invite you to the party, and then I think the last step is making us feel belonging. Is the part where people may forget how to make it better. And then sometimes when we try to connect each other, it seems like the backfire, like people are getting a bit distant, getting the wall again, and the diversity party is coming back, invite everybody to join the club. So I think some of your, some that your research is talking about why the need to connect is tearing us apart. And what is it that in human nature making us that way? We want to belong, but when we want to connect, things happen that pull us apart.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, we have to understand how deeply embedded this need to belong is in us as human beings. And that was the thing that really intrigued me in the early stages of the research. It's like, wow, when we were doing the research on bias, big breakthrough was when we realized that bias is actually it's simply a function of the brain. Sometimes it can be enormously helpful and even life-saving. Sometimes it can be terrible and even life-taking. I think similarly, what I found when we were doing the research on belonging was, and I want to give a shout out to my good friend John Robert Tartaglione, who was a mentee of mine whose research contributed enormously to the book as well. What we began to discover was that as human beings we're pulled between these two very strong urges. That one is the natural tendency to separate between us and them. And that's something that can shift at different times. We know. I mean, my goodness, your country's experience is a perfect one of that, how it shifts. At one point you were at war with each other. Now you're one country. It used to be us and them. Now it's us, right? It changes over time, and so but there is this tendency, and it probably goes back centuries and centuries to when we were living in caves and jungles, and we would see a group of people around a water hole, and we would have to instantly make a determination whether they were our tribe or not, and if we made the wrong determination, we might die. So that became, so identifying who are your people and who are their people became an essential part of who we are as human beings. On the other hand, we had this tremendous need to belong, which probably dates back again, millennium, back to a time when human beings could not survive. If you were kicked out of your tribe for most of human history, you didn't have much chance to survive for long. Because as soon as you would get sick or seriously injured, you would be subject to animals or disease or whatever. You wouldn't have much of a chance to survive. And so the need to fit in starts when we're infants. In fact, we know that a person who feels isolated from their group has experienced in the same regions of the brain, the dorsal posterior insula, associated with physical pain. That being isolated from a group triggers activities that's the same as physical pain for us. And so this and again, the collectivist nature of your societies make it even more so, because if you're tossed out of your group, where do you go? I mean, who do you have? And so we're pulled between this part of us that wants to belong and this part of us that sees the us and them. And in a healthy state of belonging, what happens is the desire to be one sort of trumps over the desire to be against them. In other words, the us, use Vietnam as an example, the us to be one country triumphed over the North and South conversation at some point. Now, I'm sure you still have tension in your country around that, but the overall conversation, that was what triumphed. Sadly, what's happened in our country right now is that the desire to be with my people and against your people is more important than the desire to all be one country. And so we see that polarization is occurring, this tribalism that's occurring. You have people on the right who coalesce and come together around hating the left, and you have people on the left who come together around hating the right. Neither of them are coming together around doing what's right. It's all about, my team is better than your team is dangerous. And of course I have a point of view about it. I very much align with one side of that conversation. But I also see sometimes that we get blinded by the biases that creates.
Howard, so what happened to us though? What happened to our human being side, the side that make us laugh, that love, make us feel belonging, make us sharing the interest, sharing the greatness around. But then now we're becoming separated instead of being united. We've been like living in our silo instead of living in the whole organizations and contributing as one team. So what caused us to change?
I think that there are a number of things. I think that one thing was, I think that 9/11, the terror attacks of 9/11 triggered tremendous trauma, and that the whole culture really has been living in post-traumatic stress ever since that time. And I think that's not only been here in the United States, but then it affected the way the world was organized in a very profound way. The whole rise of terrorism, there wasn't just that incident, but I think that all of a sudden made people feel a lot less safe. And when people get afraid, some researchers call it an amygdala hijacking, when the fear center of the brain takes over. And there are a number of things that we know that happens. One is we begin to get in a more reactive mode, fight, flight, and freeze. We're not thinking as much as we're reacting emotionally. Secondly, we have a tendency to stereotype more. So, for example, if you look at people who are proposing the ban on Muslims in the United States, people who are proposing that, if you talk to them, what you see is logically you can convince people that a very tiny percentage of the Muslim population of the world is a threat. It's a very small percentage. It's 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. Most of them don't think about the United States at all. They don't care about they're living their lives, right? But it's easier for the frightened mind to say, keep all of you away from me, than it is for me to say who's safe and who's not. And so when I'm in that stereotyping mode, it's easier. And then the third is when we're in that panicky mode, when we're in that reactive mode, we feel like everything is personal, persistent, and permanent. Like it's happening to me personally, and it's always going to be happening, and we got to do something about it. And so I think that made the fear of the other that much greater. And at first, that was the fear of Arabs and Muslims here in the United States. In other parts of the world, it was, in Russia, it was the fear of the Chechens, and other parts of the world, it was fear of different kinds of people. But then I think that very quickly is fed then by a second dynamic of this, which is media and the changes in media. It used to be we would go to the same information. We would all go, like here in the United States, we had 3 big television networks, and you would see their news, ABC, NBC, or CBS, and the news was all the same, pretty much. I mean, a little different here, a little different there, but 90% the same. And it was all kind of middle ground. It wasn't very much opinion, because in those days, it was thought that news people were not supposed to give their opinion. They were only supposed to give the facts, So we would see the same news, and we had different interpretations. But once cable news came, then all of a sudden you had one station that was the liberal station and one station that was the conservative station, and they would pre-interpret the news for you. So we weren't even watching the news anymore. We were now watching people watching the news, who would tell us. And plus, 80% of the news became what we call here pundits, people who were giving opinions instead of just the news. And so it began to blur the lines between what was news and what was opinion. And then, of course, the next layer, when social media came, expanded that dramatically, because now people would go on their Facebook page or their Twitter account, and all they would hear from were people who agreed with them. And people who would disagree with them would just unfriend them and wouldn't talk to them anymore. And so pretty soon we're living in echo chambers where all we hear is our same voice repeated back to us over and over and over again. And so I think each of these things have contributed to this being dramatically different. And now we have completely different realities. It's quite astonishing. You see, things that happen right in front of people's eyes. Here in the United States, the big example, of course, is the January 6th uprising. The attack on the Capitol on January 6th. And you've got one group of people in this country who feels like that was essentially an insurrection, an attempt at a coup. And then you've got another group of people in this country who will say, oh, well, that was just some tourists getting out of hand or something. It's crazy when you think about it on the surface, but it just goes to show you that the human mind is like that. We look to gather information that is consistent with us. The German philosopher Nietzsche once said that we see what we, or excuse me, it was Goethe, the German philosopher Goethe, who said, we see what we look for and we look for what we know. And I think that we're in that mode. We know what we're looking for, so we gather information now to feed our point of view, rather than developing a point of view from information. And no greater example of that than the way the COVID pandemic has been handled. COVID became a political issue because Trump called it a fake thing at first, and he didn't take it seriously. And so it became politically, if you were on the Republican side, you sort of align with that, you kind of downplay it. If you're on the Democrat side, you say, well, this is important, we need to take it in place. And so even something which one would say, normally you would say, let's go to the doctors and see what the doctors say, and we'll follow the doctor's advice. But in this case, what happened was the very institutions that we've created in our culture, the National Institutes of Health, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, which are places that we as a society have said, these are our smartest people about this. All of a sudden, politically, it didn't fit, so people began to ignore it. And people start to find their own information to prove their points of view. So rather than going to scientists and doctors and say, okay, what does your information show, and then acting according to that, we start with the point of view and then find, doctors who will agree with us. And what could go wrong, right? I mean, of course, we see how terribly it's gone wrong because of that. And the sad thing is that I was just listening recently to the head of public health at Brown University, which is one of our most well thought of universities here in the United States, who said that had we all come together and just followed the guidelines from the beginning, there might be 300,000 to 400,000 less people who are dead. So that's as many people as we lost, during the American War. It's just more people that died, from virtually anything else. Wouldn't have had to die if we were just, everybody get their vaccines when they're available, wear masks, follow the public guidelines, wash your hands, come together and work together. And this is where I think one of the benefits of collectivism as a cultural model, I think you saw this in Asia, that the numbers were so much lower, because when you say we all need to come together, people come together. My brother-in-law lives in Taiwan, and he's lived there for 40 years. He's married to a Taiwanese woman. That's where his life is. And I would hear from him what people were doing and how cooperative people were being. And I would say, only if we could get people to be cooperative here. So
Wow.
it's the downside of independence. Independence has wonderful things. People being independent has wonderful aspects to it, but like everything else in life, it has its light side and its shadow side. And the shadow side is it's hard to get people to align on something like important like this.
Oh, well, I had a privilege to talk to Professor Dave Ulrich. So he shared that his point of view on this one also becoming from a culture of trust. So we also have a culture of too much noise outside, people confusing, and because of the confusions, so we lost our trust on what is right, what is wrong, and for a long time, that the culture. Not just in America, but around the world also. Even in Vietnam, we also have noise in the media from this side to that side, and it makes us to confuse. So absorb information and be able to filter what's good will be something that important. And that leads to the quest that Vivian and I are actually aiming to do is about thinking. Howard, because
Yes.
we believe that our thinking capability actually not improving but actually declining, and so we try to exploring how amazing people are doing the thinking process, how do they think, and so every chance that we got a chance to talk to the people, we always ask that kind of question. So Howard, how do you think? Can you share the secret of that making you think a lot deeper, a lot better, a lot broader, a lot meaningful? So that we can learn from you.
Sure. Well, I think what most people, certainly a lot of people now have been doing this work. There's a psychologist named Daniel Kahneman, for example, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in understanding some of the things we're talking about. And what we're seeing now is that we have actually two different functions in our mind. Our brain works in two distinct different ways. There's the first part, which is people refer to as the fast brain, or Kahneman refers to as system one thinking. And this is the very automatic part of the brain. If I were in the room with you and I were to throw this pen at you, you wouldn't stop there and say, gee, I wonder what happens if it gets here. Your hand would automatically jump up instantly. Or if you're driving your car and you see taillights come on the car in front of you, your foot hits the brake pedal because it's been trained to know that means danger, and so you react that way. And those reactions are faster than thought, in the sense that we react before we think. Anybody who's they're driving your car and a ball rolls in front of your car and your foot hits that brake pedal before, if you had to think about it, that child would be dead. Because we said, what am I supposed to do now? By that time the child would have already been hit. So this fast brain is incredibly important, and it's very much organized towards survival and safety. It helps us move through the world more quickly, of course, because imagine if we had to learn everything brand new every time. If we didn't carry some of our knowledge and make quick decisions, life would grind to a slow halt. So it's very, very valuable in that sense, incredibly protective, it keeps us safe, it keeps us moving quickly, it's essential for our survival. But also the shadow side of that, the danger of that, is of course it leads us sometimes to wrong fast decisions. So when Darren Wilson, the police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, pulled that trigger, he felt scared because probably felt threatened because Michael Brown was a big guy. He wasn't armed though, right? But still, that happened, and he reacted. reacts, and out of that fast brain reaction, somebody dies. And after the fact, we see this in so many cases where if you talk to some of these police officers, they feel terrible sometimes because out of their fear, out of their reaction, out of their fast brain reaction, that happens. But we also know that we have this other remarkable capacity of the brain. It lives mostly in our prefrontal cortex, which is the most remarkable part of the human brain. It's 5 times larger than any other animal per body size, 5 times more active, and it gives us the capacity to have thoughts like, what made me think about that? Now, that's not a remarkable thought for a human being, but if you think about it, it's quite extraordinary because one part of the brain is looking at another part. What made me think about that? There's like 2 parts there, and that's not usually how we think about ourselves. And so when we started to study that, what we realized is that this is the part of the brain that we can develop by learning various techniques, meditation, mindfulness, awareness techniques that can make us begin to use this part of the brain more so that we can begin to manage our instinctive reactions. So for example, let's take it out of the domain of diversity and put it in a context that almost everybody can understand. Let's say you're working, you've got a little child at home, you had one of those days where it's just, you're exhausted, it's been a difficult day, you get home, all you want to do is sit by yourself, read the newspaper, maybe have a glass of wine, and be left alone. But you come to your front door, and there's your 4-year-old child reaching up, mommy, mommy, daddy, daddy, right? And what happens, for most parents, what happens is, it's not her fault that I had a bad day. Let me put that aside and be her mother now. We consciously make the choice to say, no, I'm going to come back to what I need to do here. And that's really what we're trying to train people to do relative to their biases, is to convince people, to teach people to be more thoughtful, to be more mindful about their decisions, so that they can make decisions consistent with their values. Because the truth is, a relatively small percentage of people actively hate other people, actively want to hurt other people. It's relatively small. Most of it is unconscious. Most of it is instinctive. And if we can get people to stop, slow down a little bit, and pay more attention to those decisions, they're likely to make more inclusive decisions. And that's, of course, what we're finding to be true in the work we're doing.
Wow, thank you very much for sharing that. Howard, we always believe in that in second chance. Okay, so if an organization is not having the right kind of culture, right kind of environment to promote diversity, to promote inclusion and belonging, and if we would like to make a change, okay, and how's everything to start? How can we start to make that change then?
Well, I think that there are a number of things that we can do. I think about it like concentric circles. Okay, so it starts, I think, with ourselves. It starts with saying, how can I continue to learn? Are there things I can learn about myself? Are there things that I can learn about the world? Reading, meeting people, talking to people, all of that stuff. But my own self-education and development. The second level outside of that is my relationships. Are there people in my life who I have relationships with that I need to clean up? I need to, where there's been something wrong. Or do I have enough relationships with people who are different from me? Are there people who I want to bring into my sphere of influence so that I have exposure to different kinds of people? And then the third level is moving into work, our work team. Are there things that we can do to pay attention to how does this affect our working together as a team? And look at that. And then even beyond that, the next level is in my company, in my organization, whether it's a school or a business or whatever, a hospital. Are there things that I can do to contribute to our organization having more equity to people, with people, and can participate in the diversity activities that people are engaging in, join business resource groups or other kinds of things, that sort of thing. And then the last one is, are there things that I can do in my community? Are there things that I can do to contribute to my community? And I think almost everybody can find something in one of those areas that they can do to contribute and make a difference.
Wow, thank you so much, Howard. I don't want to keep you long for this conversation, knowing that you're gonna having another meeting. So thank you very much for joining and for sharing your stories and your wisdom with us. We really admire you and the work that you do. Please tell Leslie that we're really proud of the works that both of you are doing, and we hope to meet you in Vietnam one day when you travel here. All right?
Well, look, I feel it's been such a privilege to talk to you, and I'd love to do it again sometime. And I just want to, honor you and your work, and thank you so much for reaching out to me. And I guess is it Sertan Ben? Is that how you say peace?
Thank you.
Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very
I
much.
wish peace to you and to all the people in your country, and I look forward to meeting you in person. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a
Thank you.
beautiful day there, all right?
Yeah,
Bye
thank
bye
you.
now.
Bye.